I'm sitting in the beautiful backyard of the Garrison Institute with Richie Davidson. Richard J. Davidson is founder and chair of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the Waisman Center, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the director of the Laboratory for Affective Neuroscience and the Waisman Laboratory for Brain Imaging and Behavior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's a mouthful, and I know that there's more, too. But thank you so much for talking with us.
That's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How far have we come, say, since the beginning of your career in understanding the relationship of mind and brain and the potential of contemplative practices, and how far do we have yet to go?
Well, when I began my career, which was in the mid-1970s, that's when I was a graduate student, and it is also when I had my first taste personally of contemplative practice. The methods that we had available to us in those days were quite crude, and they were not even remotely what we have today to interrogate the human mind and brain. And so there's unquestionably been a really dramatic change in what we have available. And I used to have science fiction fantasies of the kinds of methods that are now a reality today.
Mm-hmm. And you're referring to functional MRI and...
Functional MRI and beyond,
yeah.
kind of the state of the art in terms of both structural and functional measures of the brain and what we can examine with those measures. Mm-hmm. Having said that, it is the case that we have applied those kinds of methods to the study of contemplative practice and the effects that contemplative practice may produce. But it's also the case that we're still very, very much in the infancy of this field. Serious work using these modern methods, I think, can be dated to begin around 2003, 2004 was really the year of the first publication using very sophisticated methods.
Less than 10 years.
Less than 10 years,
yeah.
So, one of the things I often tell my graduate students is that to be in the business of science requires the practice and cultivation of patience. Science moves very slowly, and those very well-intentioned folks outside of science who hope to apply some of the insights that we glean from science are always further ahead than we are as scientists, and are wanting to push the envelope as far as it can be pushed with very good reason and with wonderful intentions. But we just need to also be respectful of all that we don't know. And I think that another thing that's very important that we practice as scientists is humility. Humility in the face of so much that we don't know. So while there has unquestionably been amazing insights and new methods, I think we're just really at the sliver of the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I should have mentioned in the introduction that Richie is here with the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute that's held every June here at the Garrison Institute. And we have 165, I think, people in attendance. The topic is New Frontiers in Contemplative Science, which is what we're talking about.
Yes,
yeah.
And I believe this is our 8th Summer Institute here at the Garrison Institute.
Wow, wonderful. It's an extraordinary confluence at the beginning of the 21st century here between these ancient contemplative practices, thousands of years old, and this new neuroscience technology, which, as you've just said, is only a decade old or so. How do you see all of this from an evolutionary perspective? And, part of our vision at the Garrison Institute, I guess, is that this is really needed for the human race to survive and prosper. How do you see that?
Well, it's a very interesting and important question, and I have a number of reflections about it. First, I want to make clear that the interface of the contemplative traditions with science is not just with neuroscience per se, but also another frontier which is going to be very, very important as we go forward is biology more broadly, and particularly epigenetics, which involves the regulation of the genome. And there's every reason to believe that contemplative practices will alter epigenetic information and epigenetic regulation, and by so doing, it will change our gene expression. And so these are tractable questions which are just poised now to really being tackled with modern, rigorous neuroscientific approaches. Now, with respect to the broad question of evolutionary change, our brains evolved for a environment in which we no longer live. The environment that our brains evolved in evolutionary time was an environment where there were physical dangers in our immediate present, and the environment has changed dramatically. So most of us, at least in the Western world, don't on a daily basis confront life-threatening dangers that are of the same immediacy as we had in our evolutionary past. The kinds of dangers that we confront in certain ways are more insidious because they're less obvious, they're more opaque, they may take more time to exert their deleterious effects, for example, environmental challenges and problems. And so one of the things that our brains do very well is being able to project in the future and remember the past. And the development of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the most developed portion of the brain in humans compared to other species, confers on us this capability of doing what we in the trade call mental time travel. That is, we can project ourselves in the future, we can remember the past. And since we do not have a lot of immediate physical dangers in our environment, what humans have been led to do, in part as a byproduct of this massive expanse of the prefrontal cortex, is to worry about the future and ruminate about the past. And of course, this produces suffering. And so I think the opportunity with contemplative practice is to basically retool the brain in a certain kind of way, so that the machinery which is unique to humans and which enables us to do things that other species can't do, instead of devoting that machinery to the creation of suffering, we can devote that machinery to the cultivation of positive qualities. And that's something I think that will be a natural outcome of the interface between contemplative traditions and neuroscience, and will lead to, I think, an evolutionary change in how these sectors of the brain are deployed, and that's, I think, a project that is just in its beginnings.
Yes. And so are the epigenetic changes, those are heritable, or does each generation have to meditate for itself?
Well, the new research, the latest work in molecular biology indicates that there is some transmission of epigenetic imprints across at least one generation, and maybe more, although that's not definitively ascertained at this point. But it is very clear that there can be a transmission of epigenetic change for at least one generation. So, this sounds like a Lamarckian idea, and in many ways it is. And the amazing thing is that it's true.
Yes. Yes, as many people have suspected all along. And that indicates that to some extent the human species now has the capacity to affect its own evolution, even at a physiological level.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, of course, the dark side of that is that we now know that environmental toxins produce epigenetic change, and they can get into the fetal nervous system and actually produce some debilitating changes in the developing nervous system, and those changes can persist as well. And so epigenetics is neutral with respect to to positive or destructive kinds of changes.
Yes, yes. You mentioned that you started meditating around the same time you started your scientific career?
I started meditating in 1974. I began graduate school in 1972, so soon after.
And were they connected from the beginning?
Well, yes, they were connected. In at least I tried to connect them. And in the early days, I dabbled a little bit in some meditation research, and I actually published a few articles on meditation in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But my senior mentors at that time made it very clear to me that if I wanted a successful career in science, that was not a very good way to begin.
Yes.
And that, combined with the primitive nature of the methods that we had available in those days, led me to make a very intentional decision to put research on meditation aside. And I continued my own personal practice, and did work professionally on emotion in the brain, which still very much continues to this day, and is part of the overall program of what we do. But all that changed in 1992 when I met for the first time His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and then that changed my life and my career.
And how would you characterize the relationship between your personal meditative practice and your science now?
I see them as extremely complementary and very closely aligned. I feel that they each nourish the other. I see them as part of an integrated kind of unified epistemology that comes from both the first person and the third person. And in our new Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin, we have a meditation space right in the lab that seats about 25 people. And
wonderful.
It's used every day, and we have weekly sittings for the graduate students and staff, and so it's very much integrated into the ongoing work life of the center.
And does what you are finding in the science, does that affect how you meditate?
The honest truth is, for me personally, not so much. Maybe a little in certain ways, but I did not need the science to convince me that there was something important here. And when I first began to meditate, there was really no science to speak of. There was a little bit of research on transcendental meditation, and that was about it. certainly use my own experience to help me think about the research and to generate hypotheses, and so in those ways they're very closely intertwined.
Why was meeting His Holiness the Dalai Lama such a crucial change point in your life?
Well, His Holiness said to me that he challenged me, and he said, you guys have been using the tools of modern neuroscience to study qualities like disgust and fear and anxiety. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? Mm-hmm. And that was, it woke me up, and there was no good answer other than that it's hard. But when we first started to study fear, that was hard too, and we've made a lot of progress. And so I realized that now was the time for me to come out of the closet with my interest in this area, the fact of my own personal practice, and it was nothing to hide. And so I made a commitment to His Holiness, and I made a commitment to myself that I was going to be much more public about this and come out of the closet, and also take this on in terms of my own professional research work in a major way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And briefly, what are the origins of the Mind and Life Institute?
The Mind and Life Institute was co-created by Adam Engel and Francisco Varela. Francisco Varela was a very well-known neurobiologist from Chile who worked most of his career in Paris. And I actually first met Francisco very early in my career, in the late 1970s, when he was spending a few years in New York and I was in New York. And that was my first contact with Francisco. Mm-hmm. And then Francisco was a practitioner of meditation, and he began to turn his attention to thinking about these questions in the late 1990s. And with Adam Engel, he created the Mind and Life Institute in 1987 to foster a dialogue between the contemplative traditions, particularly Buddhism, and modern science.
And that involved His Holiness from the beginning?
It did, yes. And originally, in the early days, the Mind and Life Institute did nothing other than have small meetings with His Holiness, mostly at his residence in Dharamsala, India. And since then, it's really grown, and His Holiness's aspiration is for the Mind and Life Institute to be as well known as the Red Cross. And that's how he talks about it. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. So what is the scope of activities at this point, and what's the agenda going forward?
Well, the scope of activities has significantly broadened, but the focus, I think, has been unswervingly the same, which is to integrate rigorous Western scholarship with the contemplative traditions, particularly Buddhism. The tactics have broadened, and we didn't know if we can hold a meeting without His Holiness. We didn't know whether it would be successful, and in fact, the first summer research institute that we held here at the Garrison Institute in 2004 was the very first time Mind and Life ever had a meeting without His Holiness. And this meeting here at Garrison has turned out to be just a fantastic success. And I think in a certain way, I would say it's the most important activity in which Mind and Life engages, because it really is about the next generation, and this is building the foundation for the future. So this is one very important activity. Another important activity is to seed the field with small research grants for young scholars, and we have what is called the Francisco Varela grant award program in Francisco's honor, and we give out small grants to graduate students and postdocs to facilitate research in this area. We also have had and have ongoing initiatives in particular areas where we think some concentrated effort may be helpful in catalyzing the development of the field, and one of those is in contemplative education, which I know Garrison is also deeply committed to. And our focus in that work is really on advancing the state-of-the-art research and identifying what the critical needs are in research in this area and trying to move the field along in terms of developing the tools that are necessary to enable the research to go forward.
So what research currently are you excited about?
In that area?
In that area.
Well, the critical thing is developing new measures, and so we're interested in measuring the qualities that may be nurtured and cultivated by contemplative practices in children, and we've identified several like kindness, clarity, and calmness, and we don't have measures of any of them. And that's a really critical need, is to develop good measures of each of those qualities so that they can be deployed in the field and used widely in research.
Thank you so much. Oh, anything else on your mind before we finish up?
No, I think we've covered a great range, and I appreciate the opportunity. And the only last thing I'd like to add is just to express my deep gratitude to the Garrison Institute, because it's been such a wonderful home, and when I come here every June I really feel like I'm just right at home, and it's just a wonderful environment for this kind of meeting and to help nurture this field.
Thank you. On behalf of the Garrison Institute, thank you. And the Summer Research Institute is always one of the highlights of our year. So, and it adds luster to the Institute.
Great.
Yeah.